there are going to be women who are homeless or experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, where to have a safe haven will mean a safe haven where it's just for women for that period of their lives.
Picture this. It's a cold and wet winter night. You drive your car from parking lot to parking lot looking for a safe place to park, one where you will not be disturbed by passers-by or the police. You have a little one sleeping in the back seat. Everything you own is in the boot. You face an uncertain reality. You have no home to go to and a long wait to receive support to keep you and your child off the street. It's uncomfortable to imagine, but this is the reality thousands of women face in Australia. On Census Night 2021, an estimated 122,000 people were experiencing homelessness. And when you picture someone experiencing homelessness, you usually imagine a man. And while it is true that more men experience homelessness in Australia than women, the number of women experiencing homelessness is growing, and at a rate faster than men. Women's homelessness is also more likely to be hidden. Women are more likely to sleep in their cars, to couch surf, or to even remain with a violent perpetrator than to sleep on the street. And therefore, they're invisible to the public. They're less likely to be counted. And this is a problem because when we think of solutions to curb homelessness, we often think of rough sleepers who are way more likely to be men. But women, especially women with children, are the ones turning up to specialist homelessness services and cycling through crisis accommodation without a pathway to secure housing. The growing homelessness crisis is a national failing and a result of the inhospitable housing market that is indifferent to the experiences of women. I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. Why are more women facing homelessness? And what would a gender-responsive homelessness solution look like? On this episode of Homes Not Houses, I'll be joined by Allison Heller to explore women's homelessness. Allison is a director at Urbis, a multidisciplinary urban consultancy, and a leader in the social value and infrastructure space. I'll pick Allison's brain about how private companies collaborate with community and governments to create livable cities, and of course, ask how we can create women-friendly cities.
Thank you so much, Allison, for joining the podcast. Very exciting to have you here. My first question is a personal or professional question, and it's just, how did your connection to housing and gender start? How did you end up where you are?
Thanks, Kate, and great to catch up on this topic. As a professional working in social outcomes, housing was always a big passion of mine because housing is so foundational to all of our lives. It is the foundation of our lives. When I was starting out in this type of field, I was working as a journalist in the UK, and social sustainability or social outcomes was a big agenda of the then new Labor government. So it was all about how does development actually impact people's lives from a social perspective. It was a big focus. That's what turned the light on for me in terms of having come from studying planning, urban planning, where this was a sort of secondary issue, to really forefronting this in my mind in terms of when we do development, everything we do is creating the world that people live in. So it has a huge human impact. That's really what got me on this pathway that I've been on ever since, and really passionate about that. I spent some time on the board of Women's Housing Company, which is a community housing provider very focused on providing housing for women who are at risk of homelessness. And again, that really focused my mind on just how important a foundational housing is to every other social and economic outcome in our lives, and how much of an issue it is for people today.
Absolutely. And have you been thinking about that gendered aspect within housing for a long time, or is that a newer connection for you?
It's probably a newer connection for me. And I think a lot of people, when we're seeing, for example, the statistics around rising rates of homelessness among women, that has been really spotlighted in the last few years. But historically, I think for me, it was just housing was a thing for people. Certainly there was cultural and gender aspects to it, but it wasn't such a major focus Whereas I think we have seen that discourse change in relation to a lot of things in the built environment in recent years, where gender has come into the fore as how are we designing environments for women. That includes housing, public spaces, how is safety a consideration there, and how do different genders experience the built environment in different ways. So we're seeing a lot more of that really coming through, but it is a more recent thing, I think, for me and many other people.
Yeah, I would reflect the same thing. And this comes up a lot on this podcast, actually, that there's this perception that I think a lot of people I speak to have been thinking about housing and gender for a long time because that's their careers. But in terms of like the rest of our sector, the rest of community actually thinking in that way is relatively new. The amount of focus we're putting on it has really had an uptick recently, which in some ways is great. How good that we have attention on it. And in some ways might be terrible because it could be reflective of the fact that we're seeing that really gendered difference in outcomes and that not being a good thing for women.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think when we think back to society over decades or millennia, how was society structured? What were the roles of men and women in those societies? And then we went through a period, probably in the Western world in recent decades, our parents' generation, where women were primarily in the home and in private spaces, and men were in the public domain and public spaces. And so the design of those spaces was gendered. And so as that changed and shifted, then we need to think about how the built environment reflects that shift. So I suppose societies go through cycles, and that's a reflection of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a really interesting conversation with Professor Nicole Calms on this podcast as well, talking about designing for girls, like designing public spaces for girls. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I've never really thought about this. What would that even look like? And she was saying, if you look at the use of parks or like sports spaces, the whole area is given across to football fields and cricket fields. And who plays football and cricket? It's boys. And then you look at where the women or the girls sit, and it's like on this little like gap along the side.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, well, what do teenage girls want? And she's like, swings.
Right. Cool.
I mean, it's different in different contexts.
But yeah.
Like places to sit, places to talk, places to have like informal connection. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, this makes a lot of sense. Anyway, yeah, it was an interesting conversation. But we're not here to talk about public spaces. We're here to talk about gender and homelessness. So my question to you is, what has gender got to do with homelessness? Do people of different genders have different experiences? And you kind of alluded to this before with rising rates of women's homelessness. Why do you think we're seeing that happen?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And again, this is an issue that has really come to the fore. So we are seeing rates of homelessness among older women aged 55 and over is one of the fastest growing cohorts experiencing homelessness in Australia today. So this has really been in the spotlight. And looking at the factors for that, why is it that women in this particular age cohort are becoming particularly vulnerable to the risk of homelessness? And there's a range of factors at play, which are gendered factors, and they include things like women going through periods of part-time work or no work, raising families, typically still being the main primary carer. Women in lower paid service related industries, so building less wealth, less assets over their lifetime, having less superannuation when they hit that age. So these are still factors impacting women disproportionately. Then women potentially ending up in the private rental market if they haven't entered the housing ownership through their lives, maybe going through a divorce or separation later in life, and they're not having those financial assets, being in the private rental market in those older years with less resources, putting them at immediate risk of homelessness. So there are really particularly gendered factors at play, as well as all of the other factors that impact people of all genders: housing, lack of affordability of housing, increasing house prices and rents. So there's many factors at play, but there is a specific set of factors that are creating a real risk in this group. So that's leading to consideration of how do we respond to that issue. And do those responses need to be gendered if the issues are gendered? We also think about the particular vulnerabilities of women at risk of homelessness. And if they're in primary homelessness, if they're sleeping rough, there are a lot of specific risk factors for those women. So even though disproportionately men are still the majority of people at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness, there are a real set of issues that need to be looked at for women specifically. Women who are experiencing domestic and family violence and escaping violence, and that being a causal factor for being at risk of homelessness. How do we make sure there's the right supports in place for them? They may have vulnerable children with them. All those particular aspects of vulnerability that need a particular set of attention and need a really careful focus to make sure we can support women out of homelessness and to be safe and secure while they're in that vulnerable place of not having a secure home.
Yeah, and I want to go to your comment there about, do we need specific solutions that are gendered? And I mean, yes, that's the point of this conversation. Absolutely, we do. And one of the examples of that is a common ground, a supportive housing kind of model. And I know that your work at Urbis has done a feasibility study of a common ground kind of development focused on women. So we're just wondering if you could talk through what common ground supportive housing is and what were the key things you found from that feasibility assessment and what that looked like.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about common ground. I mean, it is a fantastic model and has been evaluated and evidenced to be a really, really effective model in supporting people out of homelessness and to have really good long-term social and economic outcomes. It originated in New York City in the 1990s, and it's been around for about 30 years, but only about 20 years in Australia. So it is a relatively new model. But it really recognises that issue that housing is foundational to every other health, social, economic outcome. So it's a housing first model, which says you need secure, safe housing first, then all of the other things can come from that. It's also about putting the services, wrapping the services around the individual to support them to stay in that housing and maintain their tenancy. So social housing, for example, there are obviously social supports and social services associated with it. The difference with common ground is a very intensive wraparound service model. So the services would potentially be located on site, or there's offices for the services on site. So people are intensively supported to maintain their tenancy, that being the jumping off point for all these better outcomes over the long term. So they're the key distinguishing factors that are different to other forms of, say, crisis accommodation or social and affordable housing, where, again, you do have service provision, but it's not this sort of wraparound model. That's the key difference.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about this common ground in the context of a discussion about gender, because I reflect when we talk about crisis accommodation and social housing. I mean, crisis accommodation is almost entirely women because it's usually women, often with their children, who are escaping family violence. It's a very feminized housing outcome solution. And same with social housing. There's more women in social housing than there are men. But when we talk about common ground or rough sleepers or supportive housing, it's almost entirely men. And there's a number of reasons behind that. So it's really interesting to hear that this model is focused on women. And I'm interested in your thoughts of how that model is different when we talk about women and where that need might be different. Because, yeah, it's something that's been around in Australia for 20 years, but I would think that applying a gendered lens to it is brand new in an Australian context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where this report really originated. And Rachel Trigg, who undertook a lot of the research to underpin it. And there was a range of partners, Women's Housing Company and Nada Nasser, the CEO, to be credited for really trying to get this off the ground. So basically, the study looked at the fact that, yes, there are common ground developments in Australia. There aren't many. We do need a lot more of them, given how successful this model is proven to be. But there are no women-only common grounds in Australia. And there is a real need for this for exactly the reasons we've talked about, is women who are particularly vulnerable, who may be exiting domestic violence, who may not feel safe in a mixed environment where there's men and women. They may be with vulnerable children. And so there's a need for a common ground development, or more than one, hopefully, that is going to be just for women. So you have all the benefits of that particular model, but you have environments where if women don't feel safe in a mixed environment for the range of factors that may have led to them being homeless in the first place, if those factors are at play, they do have the option of a women-only environment to live in while they're in this vulnerable position.
Yeah, it makes me think about an interview I did a couple of years ago with a woman who'd been living in, I guess, a rooming house for a really long time. And she'd just received the news that she was moving into a permanent social housing home pretty much the day I interviewed her. I think about her all the time. And I asked her, what would it mean for you moving from a rooming house into social housing? And she said a bunch of things that really spoke to me, like, oh, it'll be the first time I can have my NDIS support worker come and visit me and support me. I've never been able to host them before. I'm going to cook a meal that's just in my own kitchen. I'm going to put like a painting up on the wall. And I was like, these are all beautiful things. But one thing that sat with me is she was like, years ago, I bought a dress from Myers. I never go into Myers. This is not something for people like me, and I don't wear dresses, but I bought this dress and it's been sitting in my cupboard for years. And I've never felt safe enough to wear a dress in this development. So the first thing I'm going to do when I move into my home is I'm going to go to the hairdressers and cut my hair, and I'm going to wear this dress and feel safe doing it. And I was like, oh,
wow.
Like what a human reflection of unsafety and safety in such a base level. So I sometimes think about that, from just how can trauma and safety intersect in the way that we think about housing delivery.
That's such a beautiful example. I mean, it's just really says it all, doesn't it? I mean, there's the whole discourse around, women in public spaces and women in safety, and it's something we like to not really think about, but as women, we all do. And it's unavoidable, but it's such an almost unconscious thing that, it is talked about a lot more now, walking down the street at night. What does it feel like as a woman, as a man? And how do we respond to that? And when you think about housing is our safe and secure place in the world, that's the one place we can be where we can absolutely, hopefully, like that, as that story beautifully illustrates, be ourselves. That's the one place we want to feel completely safe, completely free to be ourselves. And it all goes back to this point about, that has to be our haven, our safe haven. And there are going to be women who are homeless or experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, where to have a safe haven will mean a safe haven where it's just for women for that period of their lives. And that's what this is all about, really, is a safe and secure place where someone can feel they can recover and grow and thrive and get out of a position where they've been really in a place of extreme vulnerability.
Yeah. And I imagine it's not just being in a space where there are no men, but it's also that we can provide services that are tailored to women and their children. And I know, I mean, Per Capita did a study last year looking at demand modelling for permanent supportive housing in Western Australia and South Australia. We looked at the data of who was accessing homelessness services in those CBDs of Perth and Adelaide, and almost everyone was a single person, like presenting on their own. And there was pretty much no examples of families that came through. And I don't think that's because there are no families experiencing homelessness. I think it's because the people who are coming through the pathways looking for support in CBDs are different, right? Are more likely to be single people, are more likely to be men. And so then who gets channeled into permanent supportive housing? It's people who've come through these pathways. And that's why you end up with, concentrations of men in supportive housing. But if we change the service model, you're likely to see a change in who's presenting, asking for that support, and changing the service that is offered to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if we zoom out and just think holistically, service models are designed to serve particular groups of people with particular vulnerabilities, and that's across the whole service sector. So it's all about understanding who are those groups of people, what are their particular vulnerabilities, and how do we make sure that service system, the housing system, the social services system, the health system, supports people in the right way by understanding what are their particular needs or vulnerabilities based on who they are as a person. And that's the great shift we've seen in service provision to that person-centered approach is, okay, let's understand that person first and then get the services right for that individual. And so this conversation we're having about women and homelessness and gendered responses is all part of that bigger picture of system change, of getting more responsive by understanding those individuals and how they might be differently impacted.
Yeah. I'm interested in the response that you've received to the study and the feasibility and kind of any advocacy around the common ground. Is it something that's getting a lot of feedback? It's getting support?
We had a great response and we had a launch a few months ago. There were a range of partners involved in the study, and that's been fantastic. I think, organizations like Mercy Foundation, Mission Australia, NEMI, and having that real coalition of organizations who participated in the reference group, who assisted with the project, and really want to see this get off the ground has been a fantastic starting point. I think the important outcomes of the feasibility study were to demonstrate, yes, it's feasible. And yes, whilst this is seen as, because it is often talked about as an expensive model, the common ground model, the housing first model, because you have this intensive wraparound service-based approach, the study was really looking to demonstrate also those long-term social and economic outcomes are so impactful that if you look at the costs and benefits again over that longer term time horizon, you see a huge benefit overall and a real return on investment that's hard to argue with. So this is really trying to coalesce more organizations and individuals around this vision and understanding of the particular benefits of this model. But we are absolutely really looking to continue to generate more support for that. Women's Housing Company is very much looking for more support, philanthropy, government support, private sector, not-for-profit support. So there's a range of ways we would like to see that support come through. There's a steering committee. We would like to see new members who can bring new insights and approaches, help to drive this, contributing funding, land, expertise. So there's a whole range of ways we would like to see the support. The feasibility study models the costs of a development based on X number of people that it could service and an optimum size development. So again, there's some really tangible material in there that's publicly available on Women's Housing Company website. And again, it's bringing that coalition of partners together around this vision, and let's really try and get one off the ground, hopefully more than one.
Absolutely. That would be fantastic. And it's exciting to see that different states are picking them up. I mean, for the longest time, there was only a few common grounds. There was one in Adelaide, I think, for a really long time. And then we've seen kind of a proliferation recently in Australia. So it's good that we're getting that momentum. I want to ask you a bit of a cheeky question because we talked about this before we started recording, which is this tension of, yes, it's wonderful that we have a common ground development. It's wonderful that we have housing that supports some of the most vulnerable people in our society. But one of the pushbacks we get on it is, what implications does that have for, the community surrounding that development? And you told me you lived very near a common ground. So I'm just wondering about your personal experience of that and maybe just like the broader conflict between that form of housing and an existing community.
It's a great question, Kate, a really real issue in terms of any form of social and affordable housing, any form of supported housing, crisis accommodation. There's always going to be communities who are concerned about, what does this mean for my community? If there's something proposed near me, how will that impact on me and my household, my family? my environment from particularly a safety perspective. So a lot of the projects we work on at Urbis already where we're supporting clients who are looking to do developments in this sort of space is around community education and stakeholder and community understanding of what these projects are and how beneficial they are. But there's always going to be that NIMBY component of trying to get anything like this developed in established neighbourhoods. And obviously the inner city and those sorts of neighbourhoods is where they are most valuable, regional areas too, but there's a really strong demand in the inner city. It's always an issue. Really deep engagement with communities to understand their concerns and help have that conversation about, okay, well, this is what it means. This is why it's beneficial. Just helping people to come to the party from a more human perspective. But that's often a big ask when housing and property is involved and people's families and households and established ways of living and working. So I live near the Common Ground development in Camperdown. So it's really interesting to me because it's a quite large development and the people who live there are clearly very vulnerable. They may have drug and alcohol issues. They may have mental health issues. They may be different sort of people to in terms of whatever makes difference. I'm conscious of knowing it's a common ground development. So I'm coming into interaction with those people from a perspective of knowing a lot about this type of development and who it's to support and why it's beneficial. And so I'm coming at it from a very particular perspective, but I can understand some people would feel unsafe around people who are displaying the level of vulnerability that some of these people are showing, because these are people that are most at risk of homelessness, have complex, multiple, different vulnerabilities in their lives, and some people would probably feel unsafe. I don't, because to me it's people, and this is great that they have a safe and secure place to live and there's services there, and it's not an issue for me. But I think that it's a tricky thing to actually even talk about. But yeah, I think a lot of people would not feel comfortable living next door to people with multiple complex vulnerabilities. And that's essentially what it is. So it does need an enlightened attitude, and it needs a socially inclusive community. It needs a socially aware community. And that's where proactive communications and engagement, education of surrounding community members can be really beneficial, because the more people are educated and informed, the more hopefully they can come to the party with a socially inclusive and enlightened attitude. People need places to live. Don't we want to be a society where everybody has a place to live and different types of people live next door to each other? And we want to be a society where people can live in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood, who are vulnerable, who are going through complex, potentially trauma, mental health crises, who are going through very vulnerable periods in their lives. Don't we really want to be a society where they can live next door to us? But it's always a challenging scenario.
It's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, and this is not at all just for social, affordable or supportive housing, like any project. I have found the fear before the project happens is very often disproportionate, or is very often much higher than the response after the project is developed. And I kind of, in the vacuum of knowing what is going to happen and the experience of uncertainty, people tend to fill in the blanks. And the blanks are horrific. And then the development gets built, the wind farm goes up, the housing goes in, the whatever it might be. And there still is impacts, right? Like, we're not saying that development doesn't impact people, but I do think that very often the narratives and the stress that people attach to changes in their environment is higher than what actually ends up happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely often the case. And I think that's where the process of development being done in a socially responsible way, things like mechanisms like social impact assessment, where you can actually really proactively explore, identify what are the potential social impacts of this development? How do we think about the impacts on surrounding communities, and how do we respond to them in a really effective way and bring the communities on the journey. It's a bit of a cliched term, but it is so true, bringing people on the journey by really good, deep engagement through the process of planning a development. It's an excellent mechanism to help educate people, raise awareness, help people understand what's happening in their neighbourhood. As you say, with any kind of development, the more information people have, the more informed they can be in how they respond. And also the better the conversation to help inform project planning and delivery in a way that's going to help manage social impacts really effectively. And these developments have on-site management, they have on-site services. You know, if people understand those things, for example, they might feel less concerned about it.
I think, again, this might be a cheeky question, but one thing that I think is an opportunity, but also makes me a bit nervous, is this idea that potentially developments for women are more socially palatable than developments for men experiencing homelessness. And I see this more play out when we talk about older women. Like when we talk about social housing for women over 55, people tend to get on board because people's view of a woman over 55 experiencing homelessness is that she bakes cookies and she knits, and what a nice neighbor to have. And that's almost certainly the case, right? I'm not saying that there's a whole bunch of like raging 60-year-old women who are, I don't know, doing terrible neighborly things. The only reason I problematize this is because I think sometimes we send our resources in a housing system to maybe the path of least resistance when perhaps we have more need for people who are exiting jail or, you know, insert other cohort. This is a roundabout question, which is, do you think in the context of a common ground development, it's an easier sell? I've gone off piste and off script now. Is it an easier sell to have a women's only common ground development than a standard common ground development?
That's a really interesting one. I think that perhaps hadn't, to be honest, really thought of that. I think that overall, any development where it's targeted at people who are experiencing particular vulnerabilities, social and economic disadvantage, men or women, people will feel concerned, threatened, and worried about it potentially. But yet, perhaps you're right, it would feel less threatening if it was only women. I mean, it's a really interesting question that goes to the heart of everything we're talking about, doesn't it? I don't think I have the answer to that. I think if there's any form of housing that's not mainstream market housing is a really challenging proposition, typically in Australian neighbourhoods. And it's very much something we grapple with every day. I mean, even affordable housing that's for key workers, teachers, nurses, police, you know, is seen as something uncomfortable and potentially threatening for people if they don't really understand it. And so, again, it comes down to, I think, the education, awareness, and really good governance as well. Government being on board and helping educate, raise awareness in communities, helping pave the way, helping really back these forms of housing in ways that are accepted as part of our urban fabric. And, you know, interesting, like living in London where every neighbourhood is very much cheek by jowl, private sector, social housing, affordable housing, the strength of those governance models and policies where we've had periods of time where there was requirements for 30% affordable housing in all new developments, you get a real social and economic mix that is just accepted as part of living in London because it's how it is. Sydney's a very different, just as an example, Sydney's a very different social and economic composition because different suburbs are pretty much stratified in terms of their social and economic
there's not a lot of mixing, is
position.
there?
There's not a lot of mixing. No, that's right. And that's been talked about a lot.
Yeah, I find it really interesting when I think maybe New South Wales is the same as Victoria, but a lot of the discussion around Victoria when we were going through the public housing renewal program process was we need to redevelop this land because we've created ghettos, concentrations of disadvantage. And I just find that use of the word ghetto so problematic and so politicized because we've taken this concept from the US, right? Where like redlining and racialized mortgage processes and like deep histories of disadvantage that was deliberately delivered by government policy mean that you have whole neighborhoods of disadvantage, like just for kilometers in every direction. And then you take like an example of Fitzroy in Victoria, which is one public housing building in the middle of this sea of like deep privilege, and we're like, oh, it's a ghetto, and we look at that as an example of a concentration, but then we don't look down the road to like Kew and Toorak or the Northern Beaches in Sydney and go, it's an island of too much advantage. Isn't it terrible that we don't have diversity? There's too many like pilots and doctors in one place, you know?
Absolutely. It's really interesting too, that whole theory around mixed tenure, mixed neighborhoods, deconcentration of disadvantage. There's lots of good, solid arguments in favor of it. There's also a lot of really interesting research about the strength of social ties, social connections, mutual community-based support networks that exist in those sorts of areas. Certainly in London, that was a big discourse. There was the whole renewal program getting underway there of major public housing estates, like Elephant and Castle being one. And that was very much debated. Is it the right model? Is the deconcentration of disadvantage theory, is that the right theory to apply in practice? And yes, it does appear from the evidence that the social and economic outcomes of everyone involved improves if you do have a mixed neighbourhood, but there are also social impacts that are seen to be detrimental in terms of breaking up long-established social ties and social networks. And it's really interesting because we're seeing that whole debate here now with the renewal of major public housing estates, as we've talked about in New South Wales and Victoria as mixed tenure neighbourhoods. It's a really exciting proposition, and it's going to be very interesting how that rolls out. And the aspirations are absolutely there for that to work really well. And inner city neighbourhoods have great potential for that to work, because they tend to be the areas where that is already occurring to a greater extent. But yeah, it's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and I've taken us completely off the track of gender and housing now, but I know we both love talking about social networks and neighborhoods. So I'm going to take us back on to gender. And I have two questions I ask everyone. One is this notion of vibing and venting, which is, what is one thing that you're really vibing or excited about in gender and housing at the moment? And what is one thing that you need to vent about?
I love that. What am I really excited about? I'm excited about the shift that we're seeing in society to look at gender and issues like culture and gender in a more enlightened kind of way, in a non-binary, non-black and white kind of way. So we're considering the needs of different people with different backgrounds, genders, and we're looking at building societies and communities that are able to recognize difference, be inclusive of difference, but also respond to difference in different ways, rather than treating everybody as one big mass of people who have all the same needs and drivers and priorities. What we're really pulling apart here is a deeper understanding of the different people in society, what they might be facing as different challenges, and different challenges in relation to equity, whether it be through income, cultural background, language spoken at home, all those different things, sexual orientation, gender, and trying to develop practices to create our built environment, because that's the kind of area I work in, but trying to create built environments that acknowledge and respond to difference better. And not just here's a bunch of houses and public spaces that are designed for everybody, but actually really understanding who is everybody, who are the different people in our society and their different needs, and how do we develop inclusive places that are welcoming to everybody. And I remember doing some work when I was at the City of Sydney. We were doing a lot of work in terms of understanding the design of public spaces and places that were culturally diverse and appropriate, And I remember talking to one community member, and like you've said, there are stories that really stick in your mind, I think. And it was a young person, Aboriginal person, and he was talking to me about there were parts of the city where he just doesn't feel comfortable walking around. It doesn't feel like it's a place that he feels comfortable, and he just avoids going there. I also remember talking to someone who had a disability, was in a wheelchair, and they said the same thing. They don't go to certain parts of the city because they actually physically cannot get around them. And so these sorts of stories really stick with you, I think, because they make you realize that experiences people have are very real in terms of social inclusion or exclusion. A built environment can very, very directly impact someone in terms of mentally, physically, to the point where they may or may not ever even go there, a place that I would go without even thinking. So it's very real, the impact on people's lives, and building cities that are inclusive is something that I'm really passionate about. And that really gets me vibing when I see that being really in the spotlight and really considered in a careful way.
Yeah, yeah, I totally see that. And what's your vent?
Venting. What's my vent? I think what's challenging is when we talk about these sorts of issues, but we know that there are sort of 68,000 people on the social housing waiting list in New South Wales. And I think about all of those people and how their lives are being impacted, their children's lives are being impacted, their children's lives will be impacted by not having access to safe and secure housing in a very wealthy society where there is absolutely no real reason why that is not the case. And let's not even go there on the depth of social and economic structures and factors that are impacting that. But let's face it, in a country with the wealth that Australia has, the fact that there are thousands of people who don't have a secure roof over their head, and we have to fight for these things and really advocate for them, is just such a big picture issue. But it is a shame that that's the case.
Yeah, it is. It's a real indictment, isn't it? It's a decision, right? It doesn't need to be like this. This is a political decision, in my opinion. My final question.
We could go into like a 5-day podcast.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. Structural inequality.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, what would it look like? How would we know it if we saw it?
Wow. Okay. Gender equitable housing future would be a housing future where everybody, this is so idealistic, but hey, let's aim for it, shall we? Everybody of whatever gender, cultural background, social and economic circumstance has access to safe and secure housing as a foundational building block of their lives, just a place to live and grow from. That's the ideal future. Just a small one, just a small goal.
Yeah, but it's so perfect. I mean, yeah, that's what it all boils down to, right? And it feels like the bare minimum, that the fact that people don't have access to housing, we haven't met our bare minimum requirements.
No, we haven't as a society, as an economy. And you think about all the people I know, friends, family members, housing's a primary issue in their lives in some way, shape, or form. And people living in Sydney right now, housing affordability is a primary issue in their lives. Even friends we have who are from probably quite privileged backgrounds and have the benefits of a good education and good employment and all of those things, and housing's still an issue for people enough to be a topic of conversation on a regular basis. So there's nothing more foundational, arguably, than housing.
Absolutely.
Next time, we'll have our epic conclusion to our series, where we will answer the key question to this season. What could a genuinely gender equitable housing system look like? Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next time. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community, and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.